afternoon. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Kalamata, Greece on May 8th, 2024, and I'm pleased today to be joined by Mr. Scott Ritter. Scott is a former U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer, former UN weapons inspector, and an author, and you can find his always insightful, penetrating, and hard-hitting analysis on military and geopolitical matters on Substack at Scott Ritter Extra. And he joins me today from New York State. Thank you so much for joining me, Scott.
Thanks for having me.
So today, Scott, I'd like to focus our discussion on the genocide in Palestine, and particularly the military aspects of the resistance to that genocide, both inside Palestine and other parts of West Asia. And just by way of background, 2 months ago, I traveled to occupied Palestine. I spent time in the Jenin and Tulkarm refugee camps. I met Palestinians who were involved in the resistance, including a militant in Tulkarm who sadly was subsequently killed by the Israeli military. I visited the Israeli settlements bordering on Gaza. I saw the huge Israeli military buildup there. I then visited South Lebanon, where I interviewed the international relations director of Hezbollah, and I saw much of the civilian infrastructure that had been destroyed in the Bekaa Valley and the Hezbollah stronghold of Nebataya. And finally, I was in Baghdad, where I met politicians who had fought against the US occupation of the country and had been imprisoned for their resistance. And my overall impression, I don't think it'll surprise you to know, Scott, was that the forces arrayed against Israel and the United States in the region are highly united, quite resourceful, and I think it's fair to say fiercely determined. And so with that as background, I want to start by asking you about Israel's incursion into Rafa on the border or near the border of Egypt and Gaza. And toward the end of this past winter, Israel's military claimed to have destroyed 18 out of 24 Hamas battalions. As far as I know, it produced no credible evidence to support that claim, but it did acknowledge that Hamas retained enough combat capability to constitute a threat. And it's that threat which Israel has used to justify its planned invasion of Rafa. It says that it must conduct a ground assault on Rafa to finish off Hamas. What do you make of Israel's claim that the core of Hamas's remaining fighters are in Rafa? And do you think that Israel stands a realistic chance of destroying Hamas's remaining combat capability by launching a ground incursion into Rafa?
Well, first of all, I think we need to reflect on the fact that the actual military strength, organization, and disposition of not just Hamas, but the other resistance forces operating in Gaza are are sensitive to that operation, and they don't they don't say, yes, this is how many losses we've had, yes, this is what we've done. They keep it secret for a reason, to keep the Israelis guessing this is guerrilla warfare, this is unconventional resistance, and so you don't want to give the Israelis any indicator on whether or not their operations are being successful or not. The reality on the ground is that the Israeli operations have not stopped the resistance in any meaningful fashion. What goes into an Israeli assessment that they have destroyed a battalion is, I think, more reflective of conventional linear analysis than the kind of more abstract analysis that you would have to do when dealing with a resistance movement that is designed to operate independent of central authority, designed to operate underground, designed to hide itself from the enemy and only appear when necessary to carry out a strike against the enemy. So if Israel bases their understanding of Hamas and resistance capabilities on a peacetime understanding of above ground structures, then they're missing the point, because Hamas was never meant to survive above ground in a war that involved Israeli troops moving into Gaza. Hamas would always go underground, and I think you have to evaluate Hamas from the underground potential, because that's where their combat potential lies. The United States intelligence estimates, at the same time Israel came out with their own assessment, the United States said they believe that only 35% of Hamas's combat capability had been eliminated. Uh, the the Al Qasim brigades, in discussing with Hezbollah about whether or not Hezbollah needed to intervene, um, gave Nasrallah a different assessment. They said only 10%. Um, and that was not a statement made for public consumption. It was a statement made, from one resistance organization to another. That may have been overly optimistic on the part of Hamas, but I think the truth lies somewhere in between. That Hamas has lost more than 10% and less than 35% of its combat potential. This means that the Israelis are dead wrong about their assessment of Rafa. And we know this because we know that when Israel withdrew from northern Gaza, Hamas reemerged. When they withdrew from Khan Yunis in the central part of Gaza, Hamas reemerged. What exists in Rafah, Israel will seek to destroy, but they will seek to destroy it based upon assessments of Hamas as an above the ground organization, when the reality is Hamas will go underground in Rafah and will continue to resist. The Hamas model is, as it's currently structured and as it currently operates, it cannot be defeated by Israel. Israel's goal and objectives of physically eliminating Hamas as a military organization are unobtainable. And that's just not me saying this. This is something that's echoed by Israeli generals, men who, although they're not on active duty today, recently are totally familiar with Israel's military capabilities, their plans, their methodologies. And they've said that Israel can't win this war. Not only Israel can't win this war, Israel is losing this war. The Mossad, former Mossad leaders make the same assessments. Any military analyst who understands both Israeli military capability and Hamas military capability, and it has to be a military analyst that also knows that you can't separate the military from the political, that war is an extension of politics by other means, and that when examining Israeli military capabilities, you have to link it to the political reality that exists in Israel at the time. And when you talk about Hamas's military capabilities, you have to link it to the political reality as it exists for Hamas at the time. Hamas, another goal of the Israelis was to nullify Hamas as a political entity. They've failed on that. So, Hamas's continued military resistance only strengthens Hamas as a political entity. Israel's failure to accomplish their stated objectives of eliminating Hamas both as a military and political entity weakens Israel politically, and that in turn weakens them militarily. So I think the assessments are all wrong. That any assessment that talks about a military victory on the part of Israel, Israel's ability to achieve a military victory, is far off the mark.
So recently, the U.S. military forces began building a pier off of the coast of Gaza. And we were told in advance, before the assembly of that pier began, that the purpose was to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid to the civilian population of Gaza. And we were also told that this pier was being assembled with the consent of the Israeli government, which I think in my mind immediately raised a question about whether this could possibly be in the best interests of the civilian population of Gaza. But in any event, it seemed quite obvious that if they were really serious, the U.S. and Israeli governments, of delivering sufficient humanitarian aid to sustain the population of Gaza, they could do it through land entry points ringing the Gaza Strip. And there was absolutely no reason for them to assemble a pier in order to achieve that objective. At the same time, we've received reports and outright quite brazen declarations from the leadership of Israel that they want to rid Gaza of Palestinians. And they've even revealed that they've had discussions with some countries, including the government of Congo, to receive displaced Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. So looking at this from my perspective, one plausible interpretation of what is going on here is that they are building this pier in order to facilitate the removal of Palestinians from Gaza. Now, I don't know whether that's obviously I have no idea what's in their heads and whether that's in fact the objective or part of the motivation, but I'm very curious to know, what do you think this pier is all about? What are they trying to achieve by constructing this thing?
The concept of a pier was introduced at a time when the United States was in caught up in a in the facing the reality that their policy was collapsing. They were facing the reality that Israel was its close ally and friend was carrying out genocide, and that a large part of that genocide wasn't just the bombs being dropped, but the denial of sufficient humanitarian aid to the Gazan population. And Joe Biden, being a candidate for reelection this year, always holds up his finger to the political wind and sees which way the wind is blowing. And at that time, the decision for the pier, because let's just be honest, it's a nonsensical decision. What does the pier accomplish? It doesn't accomplish anything. As you pointed out, the far more efficient way of getting the goods in is through ground operations, through ground points of entry. The container ships that deliver that bring in these goods can be brought in more efficiently through existing port facilities. This pier is not an efficient mechanism of delivering goods. It's a political gimmick that was put together by the United States at a time when it needed a gimmick to show the American voters that they were concerned about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Like any gimmick, though, it quickly outlives its usefulness. And today we have a situation where nobody knows what to do with this thing. And so now they're talking about turning it over to private military contractors, American mercenaries, so to speak. But what are they going to do? How are you going to get goods loaded off on this pier onto the shore in Gaza and distributed to a population that the Israelis don't want to have food distributed to? Israel's not in the business of sustaining life in Gaza. Israel's in the business of eradicating life in Gaza, of driving the Palestinians out. I don't believe that the pier was conceived with the evacuation of the Gazan population in mind. I think it was a political gesture made by a president to appease a domestic political audience. But once the pier has been built, I wouldn't put it past Israeli planners, because Israel is confronted with the reality that no neighboring state wants to allow the Palestinians to leave Gaza and come to them. So the Egyptians aren't in favor of it. The Jordanians aren't in favor of it. Nobody's in favor of it. But Israel still wants to get the Palestinians out of Gaza. And so that pier now becomes, a potential solution to the problem, because all you have to do is load up the ships and frog march the Palestinians onto the ships and get them out. Whether or not the Palestinian people would allow themselves to be frog marked onto these ships and stuff, we don't know. I would imagine that that this is one of those things that, given the intellectual quality of the people who are putting together Gaza policy today for the United States and Israel, and I say that as facetiously as possible because there is no intellectual quality to them. This is one of these plans that looks good on paper when it's being shuffled around the desk in the Situation Room at the White House with the deputies meeting and everybody going, oh, yes, yes, yes. And it looks good in Tel Aviv and the Kiryat with the American delegation across from their Israeli partners. But the moment they try to implement it, becomes the dumbest thing in the world, because the Palestinians simply won't play along. The pier will be subjected to attack, will be destroyed. It'll become a nightmare. Security of the pier. And I predict that this pier will be disassembled and removed in a far more expeditious fashion than it was assembled in the first place.
So I'd like to switch to the question of the missile attacks that Israel has sustained. Since Iran attacked Israel with drones and missiles almost 4 weeks ago, a lot has been said about Israel's air defenses. Israel and supporters claim that Israel's air defenses performed fabulously in that attack. Others, I don't think the dog agrees with Israel's assessment, but others, including you, have argued that the Iranian attack proved that Israel is vulnerable. In the meantime, I mean, there was obviously a lot of attention paid to the Iranian attack, but what's received much less attention in the past few weeks is that Hamas and Hezbollah have launched successful missile and drone attacks. And so, for example, yesterday, Israel's military announced that 2 of its soldiers were killed in a Hezbollah rocket attack in northern Israel. And they say that they tried but failed to shoot down the drone that killed them. A few days ago, 4 Israeli soldiers were killed in a Hamas rocket attack at Kerem Shalom, which is near Rafa. Numerous other Israeli soldiers were wounded. And on April 17th, 14 Israeli soldiers were killed or wounded by Hezbollah in a combined attack with guided missiles and explosive drones on a new military reconnaissance command center in Al-Aramshi, which is an Arab-majority village of northern Israel near the Lebanese border. These and other successful attacks suggest that Israel's air defenses are much more porous, at least to a layperson like myself, than we have been led to believe. Based on what you've seen, what is your assessment of Israel's air defenses? How well protected is the Israeli population, and particularly the country's military assets, from missile and drone attack?
First of all, we have to understand that Israel is a very technologically advanced military power. They have their own indigenous military industries that are populated by extremely intelligent and capable engineers, scientists, and technicians. They are backed up by the United States and its collective military industrial capacity. And again, we have some of the best scientists, engineers, and technicians in the world. So when you pour enough money into such a well-staffed military defense, infrastructure, you're going to produce capable weapons. And the air defense system that Israel has produced is designed to protect Israeli population centers and Israeli strategic military targets based upon Israel's understanding of the threat arrayed against it. But you can only build weapons. Christopher Cavoli, the commanding general of American forces in Europe and also the ground commander of NATO forces, when speaking about the Ukrainian conflict back in early 2023, said that the scope and scale of the violence that was taking place on the battlefield exceeded the imagination of NATO. That NATO couldn't imagine that. And that's important because how do you prepare for war? What the planning that you do, the weapon systems that you build, everything is premised on imagining what the future conflict will look like. You say, what is my enemy going to do? What capabilities do they have? When you deal with military technologies, especially something like ballistic missile defense, you are sort of limited to the reality as you understand it. No one's going to spend a whole lot of money on concepts. They'll do research and development on concepts, but when you field a system, that system is supposed to perform to certain parameters. Those certain parameters have to be related to reality. And so the Israelis and the Americans are finding themselves where, when you initially conceive of a need, to give you an example, the Israeli Iron Dome grew out of 2006. And the experience in 2006, when Israel was flooded with Katyushka rockets and other low technology missiles being fired by Hezbollah, there was no defense for this. And Hezbollah was able to rain these missiles and rockets down on Israel throughout the entire I think, 33-day conflict in August 2006. And the Israelis said, we can't allow this to happen. So we need a defense against this threat. And so they built the Iron Dome, and the Iron Dome is predicated upon a threat model that has relatively unsophisticated rockets and missiles coming at them in large quantities over a period of time. And on the surface, it's a fairly effective system. I mean, we've seen it get flooded with missiles coming out of both Lebanon and out of Gaza. And we've seen the fireworks in the skies as they go off and they intercept. The radar is sophisticated because it can do predictive analysis of where things are going to impact to prioritize intercept missiles that look like they're going to impact on the ground in the desert away from human life. They don't waste a missile on. They strike the missiles that are heading towards populated centers. And for the most part, Iron Dome performed. It performed based upon a employment and deployment strategy of Israel, where the weapon would have the greatest impact against the threat models arrayed against it. But again, those are existing threat models. Two things happen. Well, then we also know that the Israelis have put together the Arrow system, Arrow 2, Arrow 3, and they have David Sling. We know that they've incorporated advanced models of PAC-3, modifications of the Patriot system. We know the United States has deployed the THAAD, the intercept system there. We've brought in our Aegis-capable ships that use SM-3, SM-6 interceptor rockets. The Aegis uses S-band radars. The THAAD uses an X-band radar that we've brought in. The Israelis have their own radar capabilities, and we've integrated these all into a singular ballistic missile defense structure, system. And while we'd like to believe that the true capabilities of the system are classified, they are for people like you and I, for foreign intelligence services and the intelligence services of non-state actors like Hezbollah, like Hamas. They know everything there is to know about this. The Israelis test it. The testing is detected. The Israelis publish reports about this. It's detected. And the Iranians are on top. The Iranians have some of the finest technological capabilities in the region. In some cases, they exceed that of even Israel and the United States. I want to remind everybody that it was Iran, after all, that intercepted the satellite, guidance of the Beast of Kandahar, an advanced stealth drone that we operated out of Afghanistan. After years of tracking the operation of this, the Iranians broke the code on how we passed off control of the drone from ground control station to a satellite station, took control of the drone in the air and landed it on the ground. That's not your average Boy Scout merit badge project. This is something of far more capability. The Iranians are very good. And so the Iranians are advising Hezbollah. They advise Hamas. The Iranians have their own ballistic missile development. And so, what happens when you invest so much money into a ballistic missile defense structure like the Israel and the United States did is it rapidly gets outdated as missiles advance. And it's very expensive once you've built something to go in and modify it. The modification of existing system is not something that is easily done, and it may lead to a breakdown in how the system works, how the system coordinates, etc. In short, what Israel has built is the modern day equivalent of the Maginot Line that the French built at the end of World War I to stop German attacks. But the Germans said, well, we're not going to go through the rolling plains of France. We're going to go through the Ardennes forest where the Maginot Line doesn't exist, and we will outflank it, get behind it, and now it's useless. As every time Hamas and Hezbollah has fired a salvo against Israel, they have done it to study the Israeli response. When the Iranians launched their massive multi-wave attack, they did it with an eye on studying the Israeli allied response. How do they respond? What are they doing? Um, and I think what we're seeing now is that both Hezbollah and Hamas have found seams in the Israeli defense and the way Israel has laid out its defenses. Um, they found the seams. They've adjusted where they launch from. They found the right angles. They found, you know, different operational characteristics. Maybe if you fire your missiles at a shorter range using a less of a ballistic trajectory, the radars get confused. I'm just speculating right now on some of the things that can be done. You know, different approach models. If you if you vary the height and the direction of a drone, can it confuse the system? They've tested it out and they've found weaknesses, and you see them exploiting these weaknesses. Um, and I think you're going to see exploitation like this further. The Iranians, you know, they've been studying this. The Iranian attacks, I think people need to focus less on the delivery system and more on the warhead itself. The Iranians did not use their best missiles. Those were kept in strategic reserve for the next follow-on strike. What Iran did use, though, are warheads that separate from the main body of the missile, warheads which employ decoys, which confuse the living hell out of the Israelis, and warheads that used accelerating warheads, meaning that you separate from your ballistic missile, you deploy decoys out to confuse the system, and then as all the Iron Dome and other missiles adjust to this new flood of decoys, your warhead has a propellant charge on it and it accelerates through because the entire system got focused on one problem set, was busy doing, remember I told you the Iron Dome picks targets? So now you got the computer going into the pick target mode, and all of a sudden, in comes an accelerating target that the computer cannot adjust to. It's already been programmed to do this. It can't readjust. They didn't keep a system in reserve. And wham, the warhead comes through. It maneuvers at the end just to provide one last level of defense against any potential man pads. And bam, hit the target within 5 meters of what it wanted to what it wanted to hit.
Sorry, so can I just stop? So those images we saw of, you know, these warheads, it looked to me like missiles streaking down towards the Nevatim air base and striking it. Were those these accelerating warheads that you're talking about that we saw in these videos that are widely circulating?
There are some that appear to be accelerating warheads. There's others that appeared to be taking out Iron Dome defenses that employed decoys, and then the maneuvering warhead. You can see the warhead at the end make at least two adjustments, but that's after it accelerates through. You can even see as the warhead comes in, you see the decoys deployed, and you can see the glow of the warhead as the decoys get in front of it. And then as the system is adjusting to it and starts to fire the interceptor, you can suddenly see the acceleration of the warhead through the decoy shield, making two maneuvers and hitting. The warheads that struck the Nevatim airfield, I think may have been fired from a different system, and may not have employed decoys and may have just employed an accelerating maneuverable warhead. But again, until I can travel to Iran and interrogate the Iranian military planners, we won't know for certain. And I doubt they're going to let me interrogate them. Maybe they'd let me have a conversation with them. But, you know, the point is the Iranians put a marker on the table that said we can reach out and touch you anytime we want to, any place we want to, and there's nothing you can do to stop us. And that's a signal that wasn't just sent to Israel, but to the United States as well. Understand that the Israeli technologies that they put together for this ballistic missile defense system are the exact same technologies the United States uses in the Pacific to protect South Korea and Japan and Guam. The same system the United States has superimposed on Europe to protect Europe. And what Iran just did is prove that any nation with a ballistic missile capability especially one that incorporates maneuvering warheads or effective decoys or self-propelled accelerating warheads, hypersonic missiles, that there is no missile defense system in the world now that can stop this. And that all the money the United States and Israel and its allies have poured into ballistic missile defense has been money that has been literally flushed down the toilet.
So on that note, it's been approximately 19 days. I checked the calendar since this purported retaliatory attack by Israel in Isfahan, which is a central Iranian city. I believe it's just next to Iran's major nuclear facilities. I haven't been able to figure out by reading the press reports what really happened there. Whatever did happen there doesn't seem to have been particularly dramatic. I think there's some satellite images suggesting that an air defense system was struck. Certainly nothing that I would think would be particularly concerning to the Iranians. And since that time, as far as I know, there have been no attacks, at least none that have been reported, of the Israeli military on Iranian targets anywhere, including in Syria, where the Israeli military over the last few years has repeatedly struck what it says are Iranian targets. And so I appreciate that 19 days isn't a lot of time. You know, who knows, maybe tomorrow Israel will launch some kind of strike on an Iranian target. But is it your sense so far that they have established, the Iranians, a new level of deterrence, and that Israel is exercising a degree of restraint that we haven't seen in recent memory because of this vulnerability that Iran has exposed?
There's two aspects to this. One, Iran has exposed the Israeli ballistic missile shield to be porous. And Israel, again, when I used to work with the Israeli intelligence on ballistic missile issues. And at that time, we were focused on the Iraqi Scud problem. And the Israelis have a team of technical intelligence people who gather the debris and put it together in what they call the missile graveyard, excuse me, or boneyard. And I've been taken there. Excuse me.
Take your time.
It's the danger of doing so many interviews that my poor, pathetic voice gives out. I'll try and find the appropriate tone that doesn't challenge my vocal cords as much. But no, I've been to the boneyard. I've seen the missile parts. I've worked with them as they with the Israelis as they assess every aspect of it. And they're very good. They're very good at what they do. They were able to read into the debris, facts about Iraqi ballistic missile development that the Iraqis have been denying to us as inspectors. And so by going to the boneyard, working with Israeli intelligence officers, we were able to get an understanding that empowered us to go into Iraq and sit down with the counterparts. And when I would listen to their story about missile development, I would say, well, you're lying. And they'd say, well, why? And I said, well, and then I'd say, because the ring that joins the warhead here can't meet with the body. You had to do an adaptation. And they're looking at me going, how the hell do you know this? And the answer is because the Israelis are pretty damn good. And the reason why I bring that up is that I believe the Israelis have gathered the debris of the missiles that attacked. And while Israel may lie to the world, the Israeli intelligence officers are not lying to their leadership. And I believe the message they have sent their leadership is that the Iranian missiles can't be stopped by our existing missile defense capabilities. And that if Iran were to flood Israel with these missiles or missiles of similar capability or better capability, that a lot of damage would be done to Israel. And there's not much we can do to stop it. And that's a wake-up call to Israel. Now, Israel has a way of dealing with that, which is called overwhelming military response. Basically, to get engaged in a war of attrition with Iran that would wear Iran down before it would wear Israel down. The problem is the plans that Israel has assembled for that, and they've been tested in the last 2 years in joint military training exercises with the United States. Um, Even after the training exercise, when Israel could best case everything, there was a recognition that they could not meaningfully interdict either Iran's nuclear program or their ballistic missile programs. No matter what, they couldn't do anything without the United States. That the United States had to be a partner in this, a leading partner. And what happened in April, after the Israelis attacked the Iranian consulate, provoking the Iranian response, is that the Iranians called up the United States and they called up America's allies in the region and said, we'll reach out and touch you too. We'll send you a special delivery package that will annihilate your air base and American forces on there. And there's nothing you can do to stop it. And this wasn't just rhetoric, because the United States, in the aftermath of the assassination of Qasem Soleimani back in January of 2020, this precipitated an Iranian response. Up to 10 missiles were fired against the Al-Assad air base. Each one hit its designated target with a level of precision that sent a clear signal to the United States that we hit what we aim at. And there's nothing you can do to stop us from doing this. The goal of the Iranians wasn't to inflict casualties. It was to send a message to the United States that you don't get away with this again. So Iran actually, in January of 2020, established deterrence dominance over the United States. A lot of people don't talk about it because it's uncomfortable to talk about, but the United States from that moment on had to be very careful in what it did in terms of military response, because if it triggered an Iranian response and the United States sought to strike Iran proper, the results would be devastating for the United States, as they would have facilities struck with missiles that the United States can't defend against. So the Iranians already achieved deterrence dominance over the United States prior to this April event. Israel continued, the United States, however, continued to let Israel believe that we were behind them 100%, not because we were trying to provoke them into attacking, but we were trying to have Israel operating from a position of strength that maybe would restrain them. But after the Iranian attack, the Israelis had to respond. And politically, they wanted, I believe, to respond with a decisive strike against Iran. But again, a decisive strike against Iran requires American tankers to refuel aircraft. It requires American fighter protection for those tankers. It requires American electronic warfare capabilities to pave a way into Iran, and sustained American combat strike capability to assist the Israelis, so that the Israelis could send a strike package in, drop a bomb on a location, they'd send a strike package out. Even then, if everything worked, at the end of the day, Israel and the United States didn't have the ability to blanket the Iranian target deck, and the Iranians will still retain the ability to strike back. And for the Americans, that meant that they would lose every base in the Middle East. And for the Israelis, that meant that they would suffer casualties amongst critical targets that were unsustainable from an Israeli political perspective. So the United States told Israel that, look, you can retaliate, but we're not going to be with you. And that meant to the Israelis that they really, what can they do? Because any retaliation they did against Iran proper would never be sustainable, and would only open them up to an attack they already knew would succeed. They know the Iranians would succeed. But they had to do something, because politically speaking, Netanyahu's government wouldn't survive if it received the Iranian attack and wasn't seen as conducting some sort of retaliation. And so the Israelis did launch a strike. I believe it was two F-15 aircraft, each armed with two existing missiles of a type Israel has already used several times against Syria. And they fired these missiles into Iran to strike a target near Esfahan, an air defense radar target. Whether or not they successfully struck that or not, I don't know. The Iranians claim that nothing happened. Who knows? This is now we're getting into a game of perception management, you see, because Israel did this attack. It didn't acknowledge it. It didn't brag about it, but it did it in a way that Iran knew that Israel fired missiles against Iran. Um, but it was done also in a way that Iran said, well, nothing really happened. Um, and so, and Iran also said that that was the most pathetic response I've ever seen in my life. It wasn't a real response by Israel. It was a face-saving gesture by Israel. And the Iranians were very happy at that point in time to say, we're going to call it a day. We've already made our point, and the Israeli response proves that they received the point we were trying to make. Iran has established deterrence dominance over Israel. Israel will not be able to strike Iran in the future, either directly on Iranian soil or Iranian targets in Syria, Lebanon, and elsewhere, until which time they have built a defense capable of stopping an Iranian retaliation, or they've assembled offensive strike capability that can launch a viable, sustainable military strike against Iran, independent of American military involvement. Right now, neither of those conditions exist, which means Iran has achieved deterrence dominance.
Just as a footnote, would it be fair to say that this last retaliatory strike by Israel would have been required to use Jordanian airspace?
Actually, no. What I would say is that the Israelis probably have done what they've done in the past, and have entered Syrian airspace using Lebanon, or even coming in over the Golan Heights, and launched the attack from the eastern Syrian deserts. Israel has on numerous occasions flown into that area to strike. Abu Kamal, I think, is a town on the border with Iraq, opposite of Al Qaim, that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard has built a number of warehouses and such there, and Israel has struck that place before using manned aircraft. So the flight profile that got Israel into eastern Syria, I believe, is the flight profile they would have used in this case to launch the missiles from Syrian airspace, not Jordanian airspace, because Israel wasn't in the business of creating even more diplomatic problems, and it would have been problematic for Israel to violate Jordanian airspace and fire missiles that attacked that struck Iran.
When I was in Lebanon recently, someone told me of a speech that Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah had given, where he said that Hezbollah has a nuclear weapon. And when he was questioned incredulously about this, he said, what I mean is that we have the capacity to destroy the Dimona nuclear reactor. I don't know whether that's true or not. It certainly sounds plausible, but I think what's more interesting was that after Iran retaliated for the destruction of its consulate, which was a flagrant violation of the Vienna Convention and a clear act of war. A member, I believe it was of the Iranian parliament, said, or it might have been a senior military official, that if circumstances warrant, Iran might revisit its policy of not developing a nuclear weapon. Based on what you know, how quickly do you think the Iranians could actually develop a viable nuclear weapon if they made that decision? Are we talking weeks, months, years?
Yeah, well, let's parse it out first of all. When that report came out, I ran with it. I mean, I try to avoid traps of this nature, where you, on Twitter especially, where something comes out that's so shocking and you do a superficial examination of it and you say, all right, I'm running with this. And so I put out a tweet that talked about the danger of nuclear escalation in the region, because if Iran decides to go nuclear. And then it was brought to my attention that that was that was a fake site. It wasn't the real Iranian lawmaker. It was a provocation. So we have to walk that back. Look, people have done technical analysis that I don't disagree with. When Iran made the decision to accumulate 60% enriched uranium at certain stockpile levels, they have a theoretical capability if they modify a cascade system to do so, to rapidly transform the 60% enriched uranium into uranium enriched to above 90%, which is fissile weapons grade um, material, and that they could convert this stuff inside a week or so. I mean, there would be more time involved in modifying the cascade, and you'd hope that people could detect that. But let's just say they got the cascade modified without detection. You know, the IAEA wasn't able to detect this. Then, you know, within a week, they could assemble the sufficient fissile material. But now, you know, now what I would say they would go probably the route of South African nuclear program, meaning that rather than build a sophisticated implosion device that requires the testing of explosive lenses, and you have to get everything right, because if you don't get it right, it's going to fizzle, not, you know, not go critical. That they would use a gun design. So they need to convert this enriched material into a metal. And then they need to, you know, it's just simple physics. You don't even have to test this weapon because the physics is what it is. But you assemble a gun design, which is you have a mass of fissile material. You take a slug of it out and you assemble it in a in a chamber, and then at the appropriate time, this is going to fire. The slug is going to come in, and when it impacts, it goes critical, and you get an explosion. It's a very sloppy weapon. It doesn't consume the totality of the potential, but it will give you a yield of 15, 20, 25 kilotons.
How does this compare to, for example, the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki or Hiroshima?
That's exactly what you're going to get. You're going to get, depending on the amount of fissile material, you're going to get a weapon of about that design. I would say that if Iran ever did this seriously, that the weapon might even be less. You might be looking at 10 to 15 kilotons, just because Iran knows that if ever made this decision, it's literally a race against the clock. Literally a race against the clock. That they will need, in order to forestall an Israeli American interdiction, they would need to deploy, you know, a dozen warheads, enough to say that we will take Israel off the face of the earth if you attack us using nuclear weapons. So now they have achieved a level of strategic deterrence that then buys them time to then perfect the weapons design, to go back and perfect it. Now, having said all this, I can say that as of September of last year, I can personally attest that the president of Iran reiterated that nuclear weapons are haram. Yeah, haram, is that the right word? Haram, I think
I
it
believe
is.
that's right. Yes.
Yeah, I said hammam once, and I got in a lot of trouble because I know hammam is a bath, but
It's also
because
the name of my friend.
but because I'm a Marine and my brain just juggles languages as it is, I sometimes say things that don't make any sense in the English language as well. But I think haram means prohibited, by law, by fatwa. He's issued several fatwas that say that we will not pursue this. That's the supreme leader and the president of Iran. And people need to understand this too. The Iranians take religion very seriously. You may not agree with them. You may not be a theocrat. You may think that vilayat-e-faqih, which is their concept of the supreme leader, is absurd and ridiculous. Not that's your opinion. Some people believe that the Pope is a ridiculous entity as well. That's their opinion. But for Catholics, they take the Pope very seriously, and they take their religion very seriously. And for Shia of Iran and of Lebanon and other areas, they take vilayat-e-faqih very seriously, the supreme leader very seriously. So when the supreme leader, who is the supreme leader of an Islamic republic that's predicated upon their their faith, says that this is prohibited under Islamic law. It's an insult to Islam to talk about a nuclear weapon. He can't lie. I guess he could lie. He said, well, everybody's human. He could lie. The moment the supreme leader is in the business of lying to the people of Iran, the faithful, about religion, making a mockery of everything he claims to stand for, is the moment the Islamic Republic collapses, because it stands for nothing at that point in time. Ibrahim Raisi, the current president, the insider money is that he is one of the viable candidates to replace Khomeini if and when his time comes. Well, when his time comes, because it's not if, we're all human, no matter who we are. So here's a man who is now the president of Iran, but he's positioned to become the supreme leader of Iran. He's not going to play stupid games when it comes to the religion of Iran. And so when he reiterates that it is forbidden, that Iran will not consider this, that's what I focus on. I mean, I could sit here and spend all day coming up with scenarios of gun designs and all that, but to me, that's a wasted effort, because Iran isn't doing that. And what I will say is this, that instead of a nuclear weapon, what Iran has done is build a deterrence based upon its ballistic missile capabilities. Now, in September, this was hypothetical. As of April 14th, it's no longer hypothetical. Right. It's real. And that's the posture of Iran. They are not pursuing nuclear weapons. They are not going to pursue nuclear weapons. What they have done is achieve a ballistic missile capability of such quality and quantity that it has created a conventional deterrence capability that is every bit as powerful when it comes to deterring the actions of its immediate adversaries and enemies, Israel and the United States.
Right. And one other consideration, which doesn't get talked about much, is that assuming the Iranians are serious about saving the Palestinian people, which I believe they are, at least trying to, how could they destroy Israel in a nuclear strike without destroying the Palestinian people? So that would rather be contrary to what their stated objectives are, which are to defend the Palestinian people.
I think the question about striking Dimona, I can't, I haven't found Nasrallah's speech, but that's just probably because my Google skills need to be improved, because maybe some of the search results come back in Arabic, and as I told you, I'm somebody who mixes up hammam with haram, and so it's not my strong suit. But I will say that the Iranians have done a exercise where they built a mock-up target in the deserts of Iran that is based upon the design of Dimona. And they have fired their missiles at this target. And they did it, I think, first of all, the fact that I know they did it is because they published it. So they did it for informational warfare purposes, to put Israel on notice that, as Nasrallah said, we don't need a nuclear bomb. You gave us one. And it's right there in Dimona. And if you want to play the nuclear game, understand that we will detonate a nuclear device on Israel. That's a threat of last resort, right, that I don't think Iran, as you said, would do precipitously or as their initial move, because once you do that, you put Dimona is Palestine. And if you want the return of the Negev to Palestine, you can't go polluting the environment with nuclear fallout and radiation that will impact everybody there. So I think it's more of a threat to Israel, to put a marker on the table that there are consequences, potential dire consequences for their actions.
Right. I have two more questions I want to take up with you. Do you have about 10 or 15 more minutes?
Sure.
Great. Thank you. Uh, I'd like to switch to more geopolitical considerations. Uh, I read a report. I follow, by the way, a channel on Telegram called Resistance News Network, which was commended to me by a longtime Palestinian friend. And I find it to be a tremendous source of information about the resistance's perspective on what is happening, both on the ground and politically in the region. A lot of it, of course, is beyond my capability to confirm or refute, but much of it sounds interesting. It presents their perspective, and a lot of the things they say or disclose on this channel is accompanied by, oftentimes, by video evidence, which appears to confirm what they're saying, particularly when they're talking about military strikes. And I saw a report on the Resistance News Network a couple of days ago about a resistance group I'd never heard about before. And it's in, of all places, Bahrain. And as I understand, I've never been to Bahrain, but I understand it's very small. It's overwhelmingly a Shia population, that the ruling family, it's an autocracy. The ruling family was more or less a Saudi transplant that was put there to rule over the Shia population. I believe during the Arab Spring, there was a lot of unrest in Bahrain. As I recall, the autocracy resorted to some extremely repressive measures to put it down. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but the U.S. has major military installations there, including, I think, the largest naval base in the region, if not the world, outside of the United States. But in any event, this group calls itself the Islamic Resistance in Bahrain, or Sarah al-Ashtar, and it claimed on Thursday that it fired a drone at Israel, apparently from the territory of Bahrain. Are you aware of this? And do you think this is real, that this group actually exists and that it did launch a drone? And if so, what do you think the significance of this is any? I mean, it's quite striking if this is happening, that it's happening from the territory of Bahrain.
When I was a UN weapons inspector, we operated out of Bahrain. We would assemble our teams in Bahrain, and we would train in Bahrain, and then we would fly to Iraq. And so I've spent a lot of time in Bahrain. And what I can say is that it is a heavily Shia place, that the Khalifa family is not loved by the Shia. It is seen as an extension of the Saudis. There are significant American bases there. We have Muharraq Air Base. We have the port facility of Manama, where the Fifth Fleet is. And and Bahrain is also just an important economic center in the region too. They have a oil production capability, not as big as its neighbors, but it's there. But they also provide banking services, etc. Because of its Shia population, Bahrain has or had a significant Iranian banking presence. And after the Iranian Revolution in 1978-79, the Revolutionary Guards Command created a wing in Bahrain, a resistance movement in Bahrain that has been in place ever since then. So it would not surprise me that resistance movement has been operationalized, has been provided with weapons, and that they fired a drone from Bahrain towards Israel. I mean, none of that is far-fetched. It's remarkable. It's extraordinary, but none of it's far-fetched. It is reflective of the reality of the situation as I understand it in Bahrain when it comes to Iranian influence on that island.
Having spent as much time there as you do, how solid do you think the regime's grip is on power in that country, particularly now with all of the fury at the grassroots level in West Asia about what is happening to the Palestinians?
Well, it's very solid. We saw the level of violence that the regime was willing to undertake to suppress the Shia uprising, the anger of the Shia population. And we saw the willingness of Saudi Arabia and other Gulf Cooperation Council (GCC) members to assist Bahrain because they know that there, but for the grace of God goes them. They can't allow a popular uprising to remove, a minority autocracy. And so it has they have a very solid grip on power. They try to rule benevolently. There we go. There's a word that I was wrestling with. But and they do so by maintaining a viable economy. You can, you have a high standard of living. You have a high quality of life, but at some point in time, and it's obvious that there's a class structure there. There's the haves and there's the have-nots, and the have-nots are almost exclusively Shia. There's also a large expat population there. A lot of the work that's done in Bahrain is done by, Filipinos, by Pakistanis, by Indians, by Thai expat workers. There's a large Western expat community as well, especially in the banking, financial industries. But the regime has a very efficient intelligence and internal security service. They monitor the internet very effectively. They have human intelligence throughout, and so they do have a solid grip on power. So if this drone was actually launched, I think what it's not reflective of is a massive military capacity on the part of the resistance on Bahrain, but literally smuggling one drone and launching it to, have a PR victory. I think that's about as extensive as that one gets.
Right. So my last question, and it's a doozy, is about the negotiations that have been going on between Hamas and what I tend to call the genocidal regime. So there have been countless stories, of course, about these negotiations. They did result in a temporary truce and a very limited release of hostages. But since then, it's been a roller coaster, and from one day to the next, they seem to be on the verge of a deal, and then the deal is collapsing, and this has been going on for months. Meanwhile, horror is being inflicted upon the civilian population of Gaza. And at various points, we've heard the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, and others describe the demands of Hamas as extreme or over the top. And as far as I can tell, they've been very consistent in their demands, and I understand there to be 5 of them. The first one is a permanent ceasefire. The second one is the complete withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza. The third is a credible plan for the rapid reconstruction of the Strip. The fourth is an end to Israel's suffocating blockade of Gaza, which I think has been there now for some 15 to 20 years. And the last is an all-for-all prisoner exchange, which would involve thousands of people, including Marwan Barghouti, a very important figure politically, in exchange for the dozens of hostages that the Palestinian militants continue to have in their custody. And from my perspective, Scott, this is a rather modest set of proposals, and I'll tell you why. First of all, Hamas isn't demanding, as a condition of the release of the hostages, that the Palestinian people be given a state. It isn't even demanding that there be, commencement of a credible process towards a state. And in fact, the Israelis have been very clear that they have no interest in giving the Palestinian people a state. Secondly, they're not demanding an end to the settlement construction in the West Bank, which is almost universally acknowledged to be a flagrant violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. And they're not demanding that any of the war criminals in the Israeli cabinet be held accountable. And you can contrast that to Volodymyr Zelensky's so-called peace plan, where I believe he was demanding, as a condition of talks, not as a condition of doing a deal, but talks, that the sitting president of the Russian Federation be prosecuted for war crimes. And the West seemed to think that that was an eminently reasonable precondition to talks. So they're not asking for any of that. So I'd like your thoughts to close it out about What do you think about these demands? Are they reasonable? Am I correct in my assessment in your view? And is there any reason to believe that the Israelis are seriously interested in doing a deal with Hamas at all on any terms that could be remotely acceptable to the Palestinian resistance?
Well, I think we have to start off as a starting point. Israel has said from the very beginning that its goals and objectives for this war are the physical elimination of Hamas in terms of its military capability, and the elimination of Hamas as a viable political entity. So understand that if you have a ceasefire and you freeze, in effect, freeze the conflict, you're freezing Hamas with a viable military capability, and Hamas not only with a viable political capability, but a dominant political capability, meaning that if there were elections held amongst the Palestinians, that Hamas would prevail. This is a strategic defeat for Israel. It's a humiliating defeat for Israel. This is why Benjamin Netanyahu can't accept this, because it would be admitting that Israel has failed across the board. And that's the bottom line here, is that I believe that the modified Egyptian proposal that was put out there that Hamas agreed to has a permanent ceasefire, and Israel can't accept that. This is why.
And the lifting of the blockade, I understand.
Lifting the blockade is even, the problem is Israel won't be willing to lift the blockade if there's a viable Hamas military capability, because Israel will maintain that, well, then Hamas will rearm and be able to do October 7th all over again. And they can't trust the Hamas leadership that still maintains political control to honestly broker the transfer of humanitarian goods, that somehow the Iranians would resupply Hamas militarily, etc. This is the Israeli concern, and it's a reasonable concern. I mean, if I just telling you, if I were Hamas and I had my military capability, I'd be planning October 7th all over again. You're at war with Israel. Israel is an illegal occupier of your territory. So war is war, but you wouldn't be doing it immediately. But the idea that Hamas would never consider launching an attack against Israel again is absurd, as long as it has a military capability, which is why Israel says that military capability has to be eliminated, but it's not. Israel has shown that it can't. What Israel's playing for right now, I believe, is, it didn't get as much attention in the West as it should have, but Russia invited Hamas and Fatah, the PLO, to come to Moscow to begin discussions about creating a new political entity that had Fatah absorbing Hamas into something that wouldn't be called Hamas, but would still be influenced by Hamas. Israel, I think, is playing for a face-saving way out of this, to where the entity that they eventually make a ceasefire arrangement or a conflict ending arrangement with isn't called Hamas. And I think Israel would be looking for an arrangement where the military wing of Hamas was verifiably dismantled under some sort of international framework. If that could be done, I think Israel would be able to hold its nose on the rest of it. I mean, it's a humiliation for Israel, because everything that's listed there is what Hamas wanted from the very beginning. It's an absolute diplomatic and strategic and military victory for Hamas, from a standpoint of politics, standpoint of humanity. How do you ever live with the amount of death and destruction that's been dealt on the people of Palestine, who have been used as pawns by both sides? I mean, I don't mean to be too harsh on Hamas, but they knew what the hell they were doing from the start. They knew that they were sacrificing the people of Palestine to achieve this victory. And I believe that many of the Palestinian people knew that. But it's one thing to understand that conceptually. It's another thing to bury your baby daughter, your baby son, your wife, your father, your mother, your cousins, not just to bury them, but to recover their bodies from, where they were killed. That tears at the soul. And the Palestinian people have suffered so much. But I will not sit here and pretend at all that Hamas is not blameless in this. Hamas did this just like France allowed the United States and Great Britain to kill 12,000 French civilians on D-Day and kill 60,000 French civilians in the campaign to liberate Normandy. They knew up front that they were going to lose this many people, but they signed off on it because that's the price you had to pay for liberation. I think the Palestinian people know that if you are going to get a Palestinian state, that you're going to have to pay for it in blood. Because I'll tell you why Hamas didn't insist on a Palestinian state. The rest of the world's insisting on it. Hamas doesn't need to make that a precondition of conflict termination because the rest of the world has said there must be a Palestinian state. That debate's already engaged in. Hamas doesn't need to distract the world's attention by making that a precondition for conflict termination. The world's talking about a Palestinian state. And there's nothing Israel can do to change that. That is a dialogue that's happening right now. That will be part of conflict resolution is a widespread recognition by the world that West Bank settlements cannot be allowed to exist, that eventually Israel is going to have to dismantle the West Bank settlements just like it dismantled the Gaza settlements. And that's a discussion that's being held globally. And here's the thing, the reason why those discussions are being held is because of the sacrifice of the Palestinian people. None of these discussions would be on the table if the Palestinian people didn't suffer the way they did. All Hamas is guilty of, frankly speaking, is letting Israel be Israel. Hamas initiated an action on October 7th that was designed to bring Israel into Gaza. They were seeking a decisive confrontation with Israel. But a military engagement where you're just killing IDF soldiers and they're just killing Hamas fighters doesn't achieve the larger political objective. In fact, it could backfire because the world would have sympathy for Israel because of the number of Israeli civilian casualties that took place on October 7th. The world will continue to gravitate towards Israel. The only way you get the world to gravitate towards Hamas, towards the Palestinian cause, is to let Israel be Israel. Hamas knew what Israel's policies were. They knew the genocidal tendencies of Israel, and all they did is give Israel an opportunity to show it to the world, which Israel has done. It's Israel that murdered the Palestinian people, not Hamas. It's Israel that bombed the children. Israel that killed Hind Rajab, that 6-year-old girl in a car who was crying for help as the tanks came in and murdered her. Israel did that. They killed the 2 Palestinian paramedics who came to rescue Hind Rajab. They murdered them even though they gave them permission to go there. Only Israel uses children as bait to lure in paramedics to murder them. This is what Israel do. They have snipers that kill women with white flags holding the hands of their son. They have snipers that shoot doctors in surgery in a hospital. Israel is a criminal regime. Israel is a genocidal regime. But the world hadn't recognized Israel for what it was on October 6th. And had Israel just been limited to a military action on October 7th and beyond, the world wouldn't have recognized it. Hamas gave Israel a chance to demonstrate to the world the horrific reality of the Zionists who have seized control of the Israeli government, who have made it part of the Israeli DNA, tactics that treat the Palestinians as human animals. When you have an Israeli leader invoking Amalek from the Bible, from the story of Isaiah, or Samuel, I'm sorry, and you have Israeli soldiers acting on this to actually treat the Palestinian people as the seed of Amalek, to annihilate them, to wipe them off the earth. The world has woken up to the reality of Israel. And this is a huge victory on the part of Hamas. It wouldn't have happened without October 7th. When people keep talking about why October 7th, why don't you condemn Hamas? How can you condemn Hamas? You can't condemn Hamas because what they did on October 7th is expose the reality of Israel to the world. They did the world a huge service. October 7th isn't something to be condemned. It's one of those tragic things that had to happen so that Israel, the genocidal maniacs that govern Israel, and frankly speaking, a nation of people that condone genocide, not just in Israel, but around the world, the various Zionist entities around the world, in the United States and Europe, that continue to run political cover for the crimes committed by Israel, this wouldn't have been exposed without October 7th. So Hamas did something knowingly, but it had to be done. Just like Charles de Gaulle had to sign off on the sacrifice of 60,000 French civilians. There's a reason why de Gaulle never attended a D-Day anniversary. It's because of the sickness he felt in his stomach, knowing that he signed off on the deaths of 60,000 French civilians. And I happen to believe in my heart of hearts that Sinwar, the head of Hamas, is sick to his stomach by the decisions he's made. But he also knows that it was the only decision that could be made if there was ever going to have a chance for a free and independent Palestine. These ceasefire negotiations are just conflict termination, but they're not conflict resolution. Conflict resolution will come afterwards, done on the international stage by a world that's been awoken to the horrific reality of what Israel is, who Israel is, what they can do, and what they will do if they're not stopped by concerted global intervention.
And I wholeheartedly agree. And I have to add one last thought, Scott, and that is that our governments, put the leadership of the Palestinian resistance in a position where they had to make this horrible decision.
Yeah. What other choice did they have? What other choice did they have?
Absolutely. I really can't thank you enough for taking the time to speak with me today, Scott. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I hope I'll have a chance to speak to you again in the future. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Okay.